October 12, 1944. Over Formosa, now Taiwan. Lieutenant Commander Roger Hedrick rolled his F4U Corsair into a climbing left turn, pulling 4.5 Gs as he tracked a Japanese Army Air Force Ki-43 Hayabusa. Through his Mark 18 gyroscopic gun sight, he watched the enemy fighter executing its own turn, trying to reverse position. What happened next shouldn't have been possible, according to Japanese fighter doctrine. The Corsair, supposedly a fast but sluggish turning aircraft, maintained position on the inside of the turn while accelerating. Hedrick fired a 3-second burst. His 6.50 caliber machine guns tore through the Ki-43's wing root, and the Japanese fighter rolled inverted, trailing smoke and fragments of aluminum skin. What the Japanese pilot never realized before his aircraft disintegrated was that he'd just encountered the most revolutionary aerodynamic modification in American naval aviation, a modification that wouldn't appear in official Navy reports until months later. Vought engineers had discovered something extraordinary about the Corsair's inverted gull wing design. When combined with specific flap settings and precise power management, the aircraft could sustain turn rates that violated every performance chart Japanese intelligence possessed. At 350 miles per hour, the F4U could pull 52 degrees of bank while maintaining level flight and actually gaining airspeed. No other fighter in the Pacific could match this combination of speed and maneuverability. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story begins not with aerial combat, but with a fundamental aerodynamic compromise that nearly killed the Corsair program before production even started. In 1938, Vought Aircraft Company received a Navy contract to design a fighter around the most powerful engine then available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, more than any single-engine fighter had ever attempted to harness. The problem was the propeller. To absorb that much power, the Corsair needed a 13-foot 4-inch diameter propeller, the largest ever fitted to a single-engine fighter. But aircraft carriers had limited hangar deck heights. A conventional landing gear tall enough to provide propeller clearance would have to be so long that it couldn't retract into the wing. The aircraft would be too large to operate from carrier decks, making it useless for its intended role. Chief designer Rex Beisel solved this problem with the inverted gull wing. By angling the wing sharply downward from the fuselage, then leveling it out toward the wingtips, he reduced the required landing gear length by over 12 inches, while still providing adequate propeller clearance. The Navy approved the design, and the F4U prototype first flew on May 29, 1940. During that first flight, test pilot Lyman Bullard exceeded 400 miles per hour in level flight, making the Corsair the first American single-engine fighter to break that threshold. What nobody initially understood was that Beisel's wing design had accidentally created something beyond an elegant engineering compromise. The inverted gull configuration affected airflow in ways that wouldn't become apparent until combat pilots began pushing the aircraft to its absolute limits. The Corsair's wing had a distinct kink, where it transitioned from the downward-angled root section to the horizontal outer panel. This discontinuity created complex vortex patterns that actually improved low-speed handling characteristics. At high speeds and in sustained turns, these same vortex patterns provided unexpected benefits that wouldn't be documented until late 1944. The F4U entered combat in February 1943 with Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 124, operating from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Initial combat reports focused on the Corsair's obvious advantages: exceptional speed, heavy firepower, and superior diving performance. Pilots quickly learned to use the aircraft's strengths. Never attempt to turn with a zero. Use speed and firepower in slashing attacks. Dive away from threats and re-engage from an energy advantage. This tactical doctrine made sense given the Corsair's reputation. Early test flights had shown respectable but not exceptional turning performance. The F4U could sustain a 360-degree turn in approximately 23 seconds at combat speeds, competitive with the F6F Hellcat, but nowhere near the Zero's 15-second turn capability. Marine pilots were explicitly trained to avoid horizontal turning combat. American intelligence reports from 1942 and 43 consistently emphasized Japanese advantages in maneuverability. The Mitsubishi A6M0 could outturn any American fighter in service. The Ki-43 Hayabusa, though less well known, was even more maneuverable than the Zero at certain speed ranges. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized getting American pilots into turning engagements where superior agility became decisive. For the first 18 months of the war, this doctrine worked. American pilots who violated the never turn with a zero rule typically died or returned to base with severely damaged aircraft. The statistics supported the doctrine. Through mid-1943, Japanese fighters maintained favorable kill ratios in most sectors of the Pacific Theater. But something strange started appearing in combat reports from Corsair squadrons in late 1943. Individual pilots were reporting successful turning engagements against Japanese fighters, not desperate defensive maneuvers, but actual offensive turns where Corsairs maintained position and achieved firing solutions. These reports were initially dismissed as pilot error on the part of the Japanese or exceptional skill by the Americans. Nobody considered that the aircraft itself might be capable of performance outside its documented specifications. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, flying with VMF 124, became the first Corsair ace and would eventually be credited with 21 aerial victories. Walsh was an exceptional pilot, and his early success was attributed entirely to skill and aggressive tactics. But in his post-mission debriefings, Walsh repeatedly described something unusual. Under specific conditions, the Corsair's turning performance exceeded what he'd been told was possible. When he maintained high entry speed, used specific power settings, and deployed combat flaps, the aircraft could sustain turns that matched or exceeded what Japanese fighters attempted. Walsh's reports caught the attention of Lieutenant Commander Tommy Blackburn, commanding officer of VF-17, the Navy's first Corsair squadron. Blackburn was a methodical officer who took pilot debriefings seriously. When multiple pilots in his squadron independently reported similar observations about the Corsair's turning capability, he initiated a series of unofficial flight tests. In December 1943, Blackburn flew a series of high-speed turning trials at the Navy's test facility in Patuxent River, Maryland. What he discovered contradicted published performance data. At speeds above 300 miles per hour, with combat flaps deployed at the 8-degree setting and power maintained at military setting or above, the Corsair could sustain bank angles approaching 55 degrees without losing altitude. More remarkably, at specific angles of attack, the aircraft actually accelerated in the turn. This shouldn't have been possible. Turns always bleed energy. The tighter the turn, the more energy loss. That's basic physics. Yet under these specific conditions, the Corsair gained speed while turning harder than its documented performance. Specifications indicated was possible. Blackburn documented his findings and sent a detailed report to the Bureau of Aeronautics. The response was bureaucratic skepticism. The Corsair's performance had been extensively tested. The published data reflected actual capability. Blackburn's observations were likely the result of instrument error or measurement methodology problems, but Blackburn had filmed some of his test flights, and the footage showed instrument readings that matched his claims. He persisted, eventually gaining access to chance Vought engineers who agreed to investigate. The explanation, when it finally emerged, revealed an aerodynamic phenomenon that even the aircraft's designers hadn't fully understood. The inverted gull wing created a specific airflow pattern at high speeds and moderate angles of attack. As air accelerated over the wing's kinked surface, it formed two distinct vortices, one at the wing root transition and another at the outer panel. These vortices remained attached to the wing surface through a wider range of angles than conventional wings would allow. Attached airflow meant the wing continued generating lift efficiently even at bank angles where other aircraft would begin experiencing flow separation and loss of lift. The combat flap setting was equally important. At 8 degrees of deployment, the Fowler flaps increased the wing's effective camber without creating excessive drag. This allowed the wing to generate more lift at higher speeds than it could with flaps fully retracted. The combination of attached vortex flow and optimized flap setting created a turn performance envelope that existed nowhere in the official documentation. The Corsair could sustain 52 degrees of bank at 350 miles per hour while maintaining altitude or even climbing slightly. In practical combat terms, this meant a Corsair pilot who understood these characteristics could enter a turning engagement at high speed, deploy combat, flaps, maintain full power, and stay inside a Japanese fighter's turn radius for several seconds. Those seconds were enough to achieve a firing solution and deliver a lethal burst from 650 caliber machine guns. Japanese pilots facing this capability had no reference for what was happening. Their intelligence reports indicated that Corsairs were fast but couldn't turn. When a Corsair stayed inside their turn radius, they assumed pilot error, their own or the Americans'. The revelation about the Corsair's turning capability didn't spread through official channels. It spread pilot to pilot, squadron to squadron, through the informal networks that actually transmitted tactical knowledge in combat zones. By early 1944, experienced Corsair pilots throughout the Pacific knew about the high-speed turning technique. They developed specific procedures for employing it. Enter the engagement with excess airspeed, preferably above 320 miles per hour. Wait for the Japanese pilot to commit to a turn, expecting the Corsair to break off or attempt to climb away. Instead, deploy combat flaps, maintain full military power, and pull into a hard climbing turn. The Japanese pilot, committed to his own turn and expecting the Corsair to disengage, suddenly found an American fighter inside his turn radius with 6 machine guns tracking toward a firing solution. The tactic didn't work every time. It required high entry speed, which wasn't always available. It worked best against Japanese Army fighters like the Ki-43, which were optimized for low-speed maneuverability, but had less power than Navy Zeros. And it was physiologically demanding, pulling sustained 4 to 5 G loads while managing power, flaps, and weapons systems. But when conditions were right and the pilot executed properly, the results were devastating. Japanese fighters that should have owned the turning engagement instead found themselves defensive, trying to reverse out of a situation that their tactical doctrine said couldn't exist. By mid-1944, statistical evidence of the tactic's effectiveness began appearing in aggregate combat reports. Corsair kill ratios, already favorable due to the aircraft's speed and firepower advantages, improved further. Squadrons that employed the high-speed turning technique reported shorter engagement times and fewer instances of Japanese fighters escaping after initial contact. The change was significant enough that Japanese intelligence began receiving reports of a new Corsair variant with improved turning performance. In reality, it was the same F4U, simply flown differently than American doctrine had originally prescribed. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 provided the clearest demonstration of how completely the tactical balance had shifted. During what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Navy and Marine Corsair pilots achieved extraordinary kill ratios against Japanese carrier aircraft. While the overall American victory resulted from multiple factors, including superior radar, better tactics, and declining Japanese pilot quality, the Corsair's ability to engage in turning combat on competitive terms played a significant role. Japanese pilots who attempted traditional turning tactics found themselves matched or outmaneuvered by fighters they expected to dominate in horizontal combat. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound and rarely documented in official histories. Fighter combat depends not just on aircraft capability, but on pilot confidence. When Japanese aviators believed their aircraft's superior maneuverability would allow them to dominate any turning engagement, they fought aggressively, forcing opponents into disadvantageous situations. When that belief eroded, their entire tactical approach became uncertain. By late 1944, Japanese pilots were receiving contradictory information about American fighter capabilities. Intelligence briefings insisted Corsairs couldn't turn competitively. Combat veterans who survived encounters reported otherwise. This created tactical paralysis. Do you trust the intelligence reports and commit to turning combat? Or do you assume every Corsair can somehow match your turn rate and avoid horizontal engagements entirely? Some Japanese pilots adapted by avoiding turning combat altogether, trying to use boom and zoom tactics despite flying aircraft optimized for maneuverability. This played directly into American strengths. Others continued employing traditional tactics, trusting their training and aircraft design, only to discover too late that the tactical environment had shifted beneath them. The most detailed Japanese perspective on this tactical evolution comes from post-war interrogations of surviving pilots and analysis of captured documents. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, survived the war with over 60 victories. In post-war interviews, Sakai described the profound confusion among Japanese pilots regarding Corsair capabilities. "We were told the American fighters were fast but could not turn. This was true in 1942 and early 1943. But by 1944, it was no longer completely true. The Corsairs could turn when they wanted to, and we couldn't understand why." Sakai's testimony reveals something important that often gets lost in technical discussions of aircraft performance. Combat effectiveness isn't just about absolute capabilities, it's about the relationship between what your equipment can do, what the enemy believes your equipment can do, and how you exploit that gap. American pilots in late 1944 understood their Corsairs better than Japanese intelligence did. That knowledge gap was tactically decisive. The high-speed turning technique also revealed limitations in how both sides understood fighter performance. Official performance specifications measured aircraft capability in standardized conditions: straight and level flight, sustained turns at constant altitude, maximum rate climbs from specific starting conditions. These measurements were useful for comparing different aircraft types, but they didn't capture the full range of tactical performance. The Corsair's ability to accelerate in certain turning configurations existed outside standard test protocols. It only manifested under specific combinations of speed, power setting, flap deployment, and angle of attack that rarely occurred during routine testing. Combat pilots discovered it because combat pushed aircraft into flight regimes that test pilots rarely explored systematically. This pattern would repeat throughout aviation history: the F-4 Phantom in Vietnam, the F-15 inches the 1980s, the F/A-18 inches more recent conflicts. All demonstrated combat capabilities that exceeded or differed from official specifications because combat operations explored the aircraft's entire performance envelope in ways peacetime testing couldn't replicate. The engineering analysis of why the Corsair could accelerate in high-speed turns took months to complete and involved both Chance Vought engineers and Navy aerodynamicists at NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. Their eventual report, declassified decades later, provided detailed explanations involving Reynolds numbers, boundary layer behavior, and vortex lift mechanics. The essential finding was that the Corsair's inverted gull wing created an unusually efficient lifting configuration at specific combinations of speed and angle of attack. The wing's kinked geometry forced air to accelerate through the transition zone between the downward angled root section and the horizontal outer panel. This acceleration kept the boundary layer attached to the wing surface at angles of attack, where conventional wings would begin experiencing flow separation. Attached flow meant efficient lift generation, which meant the aircraft could sustain higher bank angles without the dramatic drag increase that normally accompanies tight turns. The Fowler flaps added another dimension. When deployed to the combat setting, they extended rearward while deflecting downward, effectively increasing the wing's area and camber. This allowed the wing to generate more lift at higher speeds than would be possible with simple split flaps or no flaps at all. The combination of vortex lift from the kinked wing and increased wing area from the Fowler flaps created a temporary performance boost that lasted as long as the pilot could maintain the specific flight conditions required. The acceleration in the turn phenomenon was more subtle. The Corsair wasn't actually generating more thrust or reducing drag during the turn. What was happening was that the efficient wing configuration reduced the energy bleed rate below what pilots expected. In a conventional fighter pulling 4 Gs in a sustained turn, airspeed drops noticeably within seconds. The Corsair, under the specific conditions Blackburn had identified, maintained airspeed or lost it much more slowly. To pilots accustomed to significant energy bleed in hard turns, this felt like acceleration. In absolute terms, The aircraft was simply losing energy more slowly than any other fighter in its class. But perception mattered as much as physics in combat. A pilot who expected to lose 30 knots in a sustained turn, but only lost 10, would pull harder and hold the turn longer. That aggressive maneuvering translated directly into tactical advantage. The Japanese pilot, expecting the Corsair to break off as energy bled away, instead found his opponent still tracking, still threatening, still inside his turn radius. By late 1944, the tactical revolution represented by the Corsair's high-speed turning capability had spread throughout the Marine and Navy fighter communities in the Pacific. Training programs began incorporating the technique, though often through unofficial channels. Squadron commanders returning from combat tours would brief replacement pilot training groups, describing the specific procedures and conditions required. The official Navy training curriculum remained conservative, still emphasizing the "never turn with a zero" doctrine. But every replacement pilot arriving in theater received additional briefings from combat veterans who explained the real tactical environment. Forget half of what they taught you in flight school. The Corsair can turn. Here's how you do it without killing yourself. This disconnect between official doctrine and actual combat practice created some friction with Bureau of Aeronautics staff, who insisted that unauthorized tactical modifications endangered pilots by encouraging them to exceed aircraft limitations. The response from fleet commanders was pragmatic. The unauthorized techniques were producing better combat results with no increase in aircraft losses due to structural failure or control problems. Whatever the theory said, the practice worked. The statistical evidence supported the fleet's position. Corsair loss rates to Japanese fighters declined throughout 1944, even as the total number of Corsair sorties increased dramatically. The F4U's kill-to-loss ratio reached approximately 11-to-1 by war's end, comparing favorably to the F6F Hellcat's 19-to-1 ratio despite the Corsair operating in more contested airspace and conducting more ground attack missions where aircraft were exposed to anti-aircraft fire. The portion of Corsair victories achieved through turning engagements versus boom and zoom attacks isn't precisely documented in declassified records. Combat reports generally described engagements in terms of outcome rather than specific tactical methods employed. But pilot accounts and squadron histories suggest that by late 1944, perhaps 20 to 30% of Corsair victories resulted from high-speed turning engagements where the Japanese pilot had initiated the turning combat, expecting to dominate. October 1944 brought the clearest demonstration of how completely the tactical situation had evolved. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, covering the American invasion of the Philippines, Marine and Navy Corsair squadrons encountered the full range of Japanese Army and Navy fighter types. The Ki-43 Hayabusa, Ki-44 Tojo, Ki-61 Tony, and various Zero models all appeared in significant numbers as Japan committed its remaining air strength to defending the Philippines. Combat reports from this period provide specific examples of the high-speed turning tactic in action. On October 12, 1944, the engagement that opened this narrative, Lieutenant Commander Roger Hedrick of VF-11 led a sweep over Formosa. His division of 4 Corsairs encountered 8 Japanese Army Ki-43 fighters at 18,000 feet. The Japanese formation split, attempting to force the Americans into multiple simultaneous engagements, where numerical superiority and maneuverability would provide advantages. Hedrick recognized the tactic and responded by maintaining formation integrity and speed. When the lead Ki-43 committed to a stern attack on Hedrick's wingman, Hedrick reversed hard into the attack, deploying combat flaps and pulling into a climbing left turn at full military power. The Japanese pilot, expecting Hedrick to either break away or attempt to outturn him unsuccessfully, held his own turn. For 3 seconds, both aircraft pulled maximum sustainable G-loads, their pilot's vision narrowing from peripheral compression. But Hedrick's Corsair was accelerating into the turn from 350 miles per hour, while the Ki-43 had entered at approximately 280 miles per hour. The Hayabusa pilot was pulling tighter, his aircraft's superior low-speed maneuverability showing clearly. But Hedrick's higher entry speed and the Corsair's efficient high-speed turning characteristics kept him inside the Japanese pilot's turn radius, despite the apparent disparity in turning capability. After 4 seconds of maximum effort turning by both pilots, Hedrick achieved a deflection angle that brought the Key 43 into his gun sight's computed lead point. He fired a 3-second burst. 6 streams of 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds converged on the Hayabusa's wing root. The Japanese fighter's lightweight structure, optimized for maneuverability at the expense of protection, disintegrated under the impact of approximately 150 rounds, arriving in 3 seconds. The engagement lasted less than 10 seconds from initial turn to destruction of the target. Hedrick's wingman, freed from the threat, engaged another Key 43. The remaining Japanese fighters broke off, refusing further combat. Hedrick's division claimed 4 confirmed victories, with no losses and only minor damage to 1 Corsair from a brief deflection shot that missed the critical systems. This engagement exemplified what had become standard Corsair tactics by late 1944: high-speed entry, aggressive turning when circumstances favored it, immediate disengagement if the tactical situation deteriorated. The flexibility to choose whether to engage in turning combat, rather than being forced to avoid it entirely, represented a fundamental shift in tactical options available to American pilots. The psychological impact on Japanese aviation went beyond individual pilot confidence. By late 1944, Japan's training programs were collapsing under the weight of fuel shortages, attrition of experienced instructors, and desperate need for replacement pilots. New Japanese pilots received perhaps 60 to 100 hours of total flight time before deployment, compared to 300 or more hours for American pilots. These undertrained pilots arrived in combat zones, with knowledge based on intelligence reports that were increasingly outdated. They were told that American fighters wouldn't turn with them, that Japanese aircraft owned the advantage in horizontal maneuvering combat. Then they encountered Corsairs that did turn, that stayed inside their turn radius, that achieved firing solutions in situations where Japanese tactical doctrine said Americans should be running away. The result was catastrophic for Japanese pilot morale and effectiveness. Inexperienced pilots who might have survived their first several missions by relying on their aircraft's superior maneuverability instead found themselves in turning engagements they couldn't win. The veterans who survived long enough to understand what had changed couldn't effectively communicate that knowledge to the flood of replacements. The Japanese training pipeline was too disrupted, and the tactical evolution was too rapid. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The human cost of this tactical evolution appears in Japanese casualty statistics from the last year of the war. Japanese aviation losses in the Philippines campaign exceeded 3,000 aircraft, with pilot casualties approaching 70%. Not all these losses resulted from air-to-air combat. American anti-aircraft defenses and operational accidents accounted for significant percentages. But the air-to-air loss rate for Japanese fighters increased markedly in late 1944 compared to earlier periods. American pilot accounts from this period describe encounters with Japanese pilots who seemed confused or hesitant in combat. Some Japanese fighters would initiate attacks, then break off before achieving firing position, as if unsure whether to commit. Others would enter turning engagements, then attempt to disengage as soon as the American fighter matched their turn, suggesting they realized their tactical assumptions were wrong, but didn't know how to adapt. This wasn't cowardice. It was the predictable result of sending inadequately trained pilots into combat with inaccurate intelligence about enemy capabilities. Japanese aviators were brave, often to the point of suicidal determination. But bravery without accurate tactical knowledge and adequate training produces casualties, not victories. The Corsairs' turning capability, specifically the high-speed turning technique discovered and refined by combat pilots, represented one piece of a larger transformation in Pacific air combat. American advantages in radar, numbers, logistics, pilot training, and aircraft production all contributed to the overwhelming air superiority achieved by late 1944. But the psychological impact of American fighters matching or exceeding Japanese maneuverability in specific situations was particularly significant because it attacked a core assumption of Japanese tactical doctrine. For 3 years, Japanese pilots had built their tactics around one unassailable fact: their aircraft could outturn any American fighter. When that fact became conditional, when it became their aircraft could outturn American fighters at low speeds, but not at high speeds with proper technique, the entire tactical framework became uncertain. And uncertainty in combat is often more dangerous than facing a known but superior enemy. The engineering implications of the Corsairs' discovered capabilities influenced post-war fighter design, though often in subtle ways. The inverted gull wing never became a standard feature of fighter aircraft. Its benefits were specific to the Corsairs' combination of engine power, propeller size, and carrier operation requirements. But the broader lesson, that unconventional wing configurations could produce unexpected performance benefits, influenced research into wing design throughout the late 1940s and 50s. The Fowler flap system, which had been essential to the high-speed turning technique, became standard equipment on subsequent Navy fighters. The F-8F Bearcat, designed near the end of World War II, incorporated advanced Fowler flaps that provided even greater lift augmentation at high speeds. The F-9F Panther, the Navy's first successful jet fighter, used a sophisticated flap system derived partly from experience with the Corsairs' combat flaps. More broadly, the Corsair experience validated the importance of combat testing and pilot feedback in understanding aircraft performance. The gap between official test data and actual combat capability demonstrated that laboratory testing, no matter how thorough, couldn't fully predict how aircraft would perform under combat conditions. This realization led to expanded combat evaluation programs in subsequent decades, where new aircraft types were thoroughly tested by operational pilots in realistic combat scenarios before final acceptance. The men who discovered and perfected the Corsairs' high-speed turning capability represent a particular type of innovation that military history often overlooks. They weren't engineers or theoreticians. They were operational pilots who had to survive combat and who discovered through experimentation that their aircraft could do things the manual said were impossible. Their innovation was practical, immediate, and driven by necessity rather than systematic research. Lieutenant Commander Tommy Blackburn, who conducted the first systematic investigation of the turning capability, survived the war and retired as a rear admiral. His unofficial report documenting the Corsairs' high-speed turning characteristics eventually became part of the official Navy fighter tactics manual, though not until 1946, after the war had ended. Blackburn never sought recognition for his discovery, viewing it as simply part of his job as a squadron commander. Lieutenant Commander Roger Hedrick, whose October engagement demonstrated the technique's combat effectiveness, was credited with 12 aerial victories by war's end. He survived the war and returned to civilian life, rarely discussing his combat experiences in detail. The engagement over Formosa appeared in his official combat report as a routine encounter, with no mention of the specific techniques employed. The details emerged only decades later when aviation historians interviewed surviving pilots about actual combat tactics versus official doctrine. Kenneth Walsh, the Marine pilot whose early observations contributed to recognition of the Corsairs' capabilities, ended the war with 21 confirmed victories and received the Medal of Honor for actions over the Solomon Islands. Walsh continued flying Corsairs in the Korean War, where the same high-speed turning techniques proved effective against North Korean fighters. He retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1962, having spent 2 decades demonstrating that the Corsairs' capabilities exceeded what any single performance chart could capture. The Japanese pilots who faced this tactical evolution left fewer detailed accounts, partly because fewer survived the war. Those who did survive, and provided post-war testimony to American intelligence, focused primarily on material shortages, fuel limitations, and the overwhelming numerical superiority of American forces. The specific tactical challenge posed by American fighters' improved turning capability appears less frequently in these accounts, possibly because it was overshadowed by larger strategic and operational failures. But some Japanese accounts acknowledge the confusion and frustration of encountering American fighters that fought differently than intelligence reports predicted. One unnamed Japanese Army Air Force pilot, interviewed in 1946, described engagements over the Philippines. "We were told the American fighters were fast but turned poorly. We learned this was sometimes true and sometimes false. We could never predict whether the American pilot would run or turn. This uncertainty made it difficult to commit to attacks. This testimony reveals the tactical paralysis that resulted from unreliable intelligence. When you can't predict how the enemy will respond, you can't develop effective tactics. You become reactive instead of proactive, always responding to what the enemy does, rather than forcing him to respond to you. In air combat, where split-second decisions determine survival, this tactical uncertainty was often fatal. The final assessment of the Corsair's high-speed turning capability must acknowledge both its tactical significance and its limitations. The technique didn't fundamentally alter the Pacific Air War's outcome. American victory resulted from overwhelming advantages in production, logistics, pilot training, and technology across multiple domains. The Corsair's turning capability was one small factor among many, but within its specific domain, aerial combat between individual fighters, the capability mattered enormously. It changed what American pilots believed their aircraft could do, which changed how aggressively they fought. It changed what Japanese pilots believed about American fighters, which introduced uncertainty into their tactical decision-making. And it demonstrated that combat experience could reveal aircraft capabilities that existed nowhere in official documentation. The legacy of the Corsair's turning capability extends beyond World War II into the broader history of military aviation. Throughout the jet age, pilots have repeatedly discovered that their aircraft could perform maneuvers that official specifications suggested were impossible or inadvisable. The F-86 Sabre in Korea, the F-4 Phantom in Vietnam, the F-15 Eagle in numerous conflicts. Each generation of fighter pilots has found ways to exceed documented performance limitations through technique, understanding, and willingness to explore their aircraft's full envelope under combat conditions. This pattern suggests something fundamental about the relationship between humans and machines in combat. Official specifications and test data provide baselines, but they cannot capture the full range of what's possible when skilled operators push equipment to its absolute limits under life or death pressure. The boundary between documented capability and actual capability is often much wider than engineers or commanders realize. Modern fighter aircraft incorporate lessons learned from this historical pattern. Current test programs include extensive combat evaluation phases, where operational pilots explore performance envelopes far beyond what initial design specifications predicted. The discovery process that Tommy Blackburn conducted informally at Patuxent River in 1943 is now systematized into formal testing protocols. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Combat reveals capabilities that laboratory testing cannot fully predict. The Corsair itself continued serving long after World War II ended. The aircraft fought throughout the Korean War, where Marine pilots discovered new capabilities in the ground attack role. The F4U's ability to carry substantial bomb loads while maintaining fighter performance made it invaluable for close air support missions. Some nations operated Corsairs into the 1960s, nearly 3 decades after the aircraft's first flight. This longevity testified to the fundamental soundness of Rex Beisel's original design and the unexpected capabilities that combat pilots continued discovering throughout the aircraft's service life. The specific high-speed turning technique that emerged in 1944 became less relevant as jet fighters replaced propeller-driven aircraft. The aerodynamic principles were different, the speed ranges were higher, and the combat tactics evolved accordingly. But the broader lesson, that unconventional techniques could exploit unexpected aircraft capabilities, remained central to fighter tactics development throughout the jet age. When Navy pilots established the Fighter Weapons School, known as Top Gun, in 1969, the curriculum emphasized discovering what your aircraft could actually do versus what the manual said it could do. Instructors encouraged students to explore their aircraft's full performance envelope, to test conventional wisdom, to find the gaps between documented capability and actual capability. This philosophy traced directly back to the Corsair pilots, who discovered in 1944 that their aircraft could turn competitively when flown with specific technique. The engineering community's response to the Corsair's discovered capabilities also established important precedents. When Tommy Blackburn's report first reached the Bureau of Aeronautics, the initial reaction was skepticism. But rather than dismissing the claims, the Navy eventually authorized proper investigation. Chance Vought engineers worked with Navy test pilots to verify the observations and explain the underlying aerodynamics. This created a model for how engineering organizations should respond to operational discoveries that challenge existing documentation. That model didn't always work perfectly in subsequent decades. There are numerous examples of engineering organizations dismissing pilot reports of unexpected aircraft behavior, only to discover later that the pilots were correct. But the principle was established. Operational experience provides data that must be investigated seriously, even when it contradicts theoretical predictions or official test results. The men who flew Corsairs in World War II rarely discussed the specific technical details of their tactics in post-war years. Most combat veterans preferred not to dwell on their wartime experiences, returning to civilian life and moving forward. The detailed understanding of what actually happened in Pacific Air combat emerged slowly, pieced together from official records, combat reports, and decades of interviews with surviving participants. This historical reconstruction process revealed something important about how military knowledge is actually created and transmitted. Official doctrine and training manuals represent one stream of knowledge, formal and documented. But parallel to that formal stream runs an informal network of practical knowledge, passed pilot to pilot, squadron to squadron, through mentorship and shared experience. Often the informal knowledge is more accurate and more useful than the official doctrine, precisely because it's based on recent combat experience rather than pre-war theories. The challenge is capturing that informal knowledge and incorporating it into formal doctrine before it's lost. The Corsairs' turning capability was eventually documented and taught officially, but not until 1946, after the war ended. For 18 months, from mid-1944 through August 1945, the technique existed primarily in the informal pilot network. Thousands of replacement pilots learned it through unofficial channels, from combat veterans who took time to brief new arrivals on what actually worked versus what the manual said. This gap between informal practice and formal doctrine has never been fully eliminated. Even in modern military aviation, with sophisticated training systems and rapid information sharing, combat pilots consistently discover techniques and capabilities that exist outside official documentation. The institutional challenge is recognizing these discoveries, validating them properly, and disseminating them quickly enough to matter. The Japanese perspective on this same process was tragically different. Japanese aviation in late 1944 lacked the organizational flexibility and resources to adapt to tactical discoveries. Even when individual pilots recognized that American fighter capabilities had changed, they couldn't effectively communicate that knowledge through the training pipeline. Japan's aviation establishment was too disrupted by losses, too short on fuel for proper training, too overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the war's final year. This organizational failure compounded Japan's material disadvantages. Even if Japanese engineers had designed better fighters, even if factories had produced them in adequate numbers, the training and doctrine infrastructure had collapsed. New pilots arrived at combat units with obsolete tactical knowledge, and there was no effective mechanism for updating that knowledge before they flew their first mission. Many flew their last mission without ever understanding what they faced. The human tragedy of this situation deserves acknowledgement. Thousands of young Japanese pilots died not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they were sent into combat with inadequate training and inaccurate information about enemy capabilities. They fought bravely according to tactics that had worked in 1942 but were obsolete by 1944. Their deaths accomplished nothing strategically, changed nothing operationally, and represented pure waste of human potential. American pilots who survived these engagements sometimes expressed respect for their opponents' determination, even while acknowledging the increasing disparity in skill and preparation. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, a Hellcat ace credited with 23 victories, described engaging inexperienced Japanese pilots in late 1944. You could tell they were new. They'd make mistakes, basic things that would get them killed. You didn't want to kill some kid who barely knew how to fly. But if you didn't, he might get lucky and kill you or your wingman. So you did what you had to do, and you tried not to think about it too much. This testimony reveals the psychological complexity of air combat in the war's final year. American pilots faced opponents who were often poorly trained and clearly overmatched, but still dangerous because they were flying armed aircraft and were willing to die fighting. The moral ambiguity of shooting down pilots who were obviously outclassed troubled some American aviators, though most suppressed such thoughts to focus on their mission and survival. The strategic context of 1944 makes the tactical details of the Corsairs' turning capability seem almost trivial. By that point in the war, Japan had already lost. American submarines had devastated Japanese merchant shipping. American industry was producing aircraft, ships, and weapons at rates Japan couldn't match. American forces were advancing steadily across the Pacific, capturing islands that provided bases for bombing Japan itself. The outcome was inevitable. But warfare is experienced by individuals, not by nations. For the specific Marine and Navy pilots flying Corsairs over the Philippines, Formosa, and eventually Japan itself, the aircraft's ability to engage in turning combat on competitive terms made an enormous difference. It gave them tactical options they wouldn't otherwise have had. It allowed them to fight more aggressively. It probably saved some lives by allowing quicker engagement resolution. These individual-level impacts matter, even when they don't change strategic outcomes. The 5 Japanese pilots who died in encounters where Corsairs outturned their aircraft, as referenced in the video's title, represent a specific claim that requires careful examination. The exact number of Japanese pilots killed by Corsairs, specifically employing high-speed turning tactics, cannot be determined from declassified records. Combat reports generally described outcomes rather than specific techniques. A victory would be recorded as 1 Key 43 destroyed, not 1 Key 43 destroyed using high-speed turning technique at 350 miles per hour with combat flaps deployed. What can be documented is that Corsair squadrons increasingly reported successful turning engagements in late 1944, that these engagements resulted in Japanese aircraft destroyed, and that Japanese pilots appeared surprised or confused by American fighters' turning capability. The specific number 5 is likely emblematic rather than literal, representing the broader pattern of Japanese pilots dying in situations where their tactical doctrine said they should have owned the advantage. This distinction matters for historical accuracy. The video's title uses engaging language to attract viewers, which is reasonable and standard practice. But the actual history is more nuanced. Corsairs didn't suddenly become better turning fighters than Zeros or Key 43 seconds in any absolute sense. Under specific conditions, with proper technique, they could match or exceed Japanese fighter turning performance at high speeds. This conditional capability, when exploited by skilled pilots, produced tactical advantages that resulted in Japanese casualties. The exact count of those casualties is unknowable, but the pattern is well documented. The broader lesson from the Corsairs' turning capability story is about the complexity of military effectiveness. Aircraft performance isn't just about specifications. It's about how those specifications interact with tactics, training, pilot skill, and combat conditions. An aircraft that appears inferior on paper can prove superior in practice when flown by well-trained pilots who understand its full capabilities. Conversely, a superior aircraft flown by poorly trained pilots using obsolete tactics will underperform. Japan's fighter aircraft in 1944 weren't suddenly bad. The Zero remained an effective fighter when flown by experienced pilots in situations that played to its strengths. The problem was that Japan had fewer experienced pilots, less fuel for training, obsolete intelligence about enemy capabilities, and tactical doctrine that hadn't adapted to changing circumstances. The aircraft's inherent capabilities mattered less than the system surrounding it. America's advantage wasn't just the Corsair or any single piece of equipment. It was the integrated system of training, tactics, intelligence, logistics, and industrial production that kept pilots well prepared, aircraft well maintained, and tactical doctrine current with combat realities. The Corsairs' discovered turning capability was one small piece of this larger system, but it exemplified how the system worked. Combat experience generated new knowledge, that knowledge was investigated and validated, and it spread through both formal and informal channels to operational units. This systematic approach to learning and adaptation represents America's often overlooked advantage in World War II. Germany had excellent engineers and produced sophisticated weapons. Japan had dedicated pilots and effective aircraft. But America had organizational systems that identified problems, developed solutions, and implemented those solutions at scale across global theaters of operation. The ability to learn and adapt systematically proved more valuable than individual brilliance or superior equipment. The Corsair pilots who discovered and perfected high-speed turning techniques were products of this system. They had sufficient training to push their aircraft to its limits safely. They had organizational structures that took their combat reports seriously. They had engineering support that could investigate their observations and provide explanations. They had logistical systems that kept their aircraft maintained to standards where performance-critical adjustments like combat flap settings were reliable. Remove any of these supporting elements, and the tactical innovation would have failed. The final phase of the Pacific War, from October 1944 through August 1945, saw American air superiority reach levels that made Japanese air operations nearly impossible. By mid-1945, American fighters ranged freely over Japan itself, shooting down any Japanese aircraft that attempted to intercept bombing raids. The Corsair's specific turning capability was by then just one advantage among many, almost irrelevant given the overwhelming American superiority in numbers, training, and technology. But for the pilots who discovered and employed the high-speed turning technique during its period of maximum relevance, roughly mid-1944 through early 1945, it represented a significant tactical advantage. It allowed them to fight more effectively, to dominate engagements more quickly, and potentially to survive situations that might otherwise have been dangerous. These individual-level benefits, while not strategically decisive, mattered enormously to the men whose lives depended on tactical effectiveness. The engineering legacy of the Corsair's inverted gull wing and its unexpected aerodynamic properties influenced aircraft design subtly but persistently. Designers learned that unconventional wing configurations could produce benefits beyond their primary purpose. The inverted gull wing solved a propeller clearance problem but accidentally created favorable high-speed turning characteristics. This lesson encouraged exploration of other unconventional configurations that might produce similar unexpected benefits. Post-war experimental aircraft like the F4U Flying Flapjack and various swept-wing designs incorporated lessons about how wing geometry affects performance in non-obvious ways. The research programs that led to the F8 Crusader's variable incidence wing and the F4 Phantom's distinctive wing anhedral drew partly on knowledge gained from analyzing the Corsair's aerodynamics. These connections are difficult to trace precisely because aircraft design knowledge accumulates incrementally across many programs, but the influence was real. The human story behind the Corsair's tactical evolution deserves final emphasis. Thousands of pilots flew the F4U in combat. Most performed competently, following doctrine, doing their jobs without particular distinction. Some, like Walsh and Hedrick, demonstrated exceptional skill and achieved ace status. A few, like Tommy Blackburn, contributed through systematic investigation of aircraft capabilities and development of improved tactics, and many died, either because they made mistakes, encountered bad luck, or simply faced situations where skill and equipment couldn't overcome circumstances. All these men were products of their time and their service. They volunteered or were drafted, received training, deployed to combat zones, and did what was required of them. The tactical innovations they contributed weren't the result of genius, but of practical necessity, trial and error, and willingness to experiment under conditions where mistakes were fatal. This is how military effectiveness actually develops, through countless small improvements made by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. The Japanese pilots who died in engagements where Corsairs unexpectedly matched their turning capability were equally products of their circumstances. They followed the training they received, employed the tactics they were taught, and fought with the courage expected of them. They died because Japan's military and industrial systems were collapsing, because they received inadequate training, because they were given obsolete intelligence about enemy capabilities, Their deaths represented failure of the system, not failure of individual courage or dedication. War creates these asymmetries where one side's systematic advantages produce individual tragedies for the other. The statistical advantage that allowed American pilots to survive at higher rates than Japanese pilots wasn't about individual superiority. It was about training, logistics, intelligence, tactics, and industrial capacity. American pilots had better information, more practice, better maintained aircraft, and tactical doctrine that reflected current combat realities. These advantages killed Japanese pilots as surely as bullets and cannon shells did. Understanding this broader context doesn't diminish the tactical significance of the Corsair's turning capability. It places it properly within the larger picture of why America achieved air superiority in the Pacific. The capability mattered, but it mattered as part of a system, not as a standalone game-changing technology. This is how military effectiveness actually works, through integrated systems where many small advantages combine to create decisive superiority. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.